And so it was kind of the end of the Edgar Vint, Francis Haskell age, you could say, and a transition to a new time. It really made a tremendous difference, also to my understanding of what multidisciplinarity, in fact, really means when done sensitively and thoughtfully. So I thought, on that note, not only in your own work, taking us from workshops to guilds, but also in teaching, mentoring, and writing about both theory and practice, and history and art history. In Oxford, it's always been very much two separate disciplines, and if anything, art history has always been subsumed within not just history, but modern history, with a capital M and capital H under their umbrella. And when I was in Oxford, thanks to you and other examples like Martin Kemp, I never felt like that there was any kind of a division, that one could not, in fact, even be an art historian worth their salt without being a historian, without working with archives, without working with matter in practice. Both your work, of course, one has to think of not only Antonello da Messina and Duccio, but Dante as well. It makes me think of the poetics of time, and the speakers in the next session titled Conversations Across Time, in knowing their own biographies. I think this will resonate with them too. I thought that I would begin with a poem, if I may be permitted to do so. And it's actually the very final section, my poem titled from the last year of the 1960s, written by someone who will be, I'm sure, quite familiar to many of you, especially those of you from the American South. This is a passage from Robert Penn Warren's Tell Me a Story. Robert Penn Warren is from Guthrie, Kentucky, and in fact, I think at the age of 22, 23, was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford at New College. Penn Warren writes, "Long ago in Kentucky, I, a boy, stood by a dirt road in first dark and heard the great geese fleet northward. I could not see them, there being no moon and the stars sparse. I heard them. I did not know what was happening in my heart. It was the season before the elderberry blooms. Therefore, they were going north. The sound was passing northward. Tell me a story. In this century and moment of mania, tell me a story. Make it a story of great distances in starlight. The name of the story will be time, but you must not pronounce its name. Tell me a story of deep delight." And so the speakers in this session, of course, will deal with matters of time, but really in the plurality of the word, how words, images, objects speak across multiple times, and how art historians can tune into these dialogues, both in their own time and, of course, in the time of the image makers, the ever-changing presence of both. The papers will range from the 15th and 16th centuries to the 19th, and engage with phenomenology, with close readings of texts and objects, and also the philosophy of Hans-Georg Gadamer. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. We're changing the order a little bit. I would love to introduce Hannah Skoda from the University of Oxford. And just to say a few words about Dr. Skoda. She is a fellow and tutor in medieval history at St. John's College and works on the social and cultural history of the later Middle Ages. Her DPhil thesis was supervised by none other than Gervase. Hannah has published on a wide range of topics, including medieval violence, Dante, again, he reemerges, nostalgia, medieval slavery, ownership, and devotion to the non-binary Saint Wilgefortis, who would have been the perfect subject for a conference that was just here a couple of weeks ago on hairiness, furriness, and hirsute beings, both mortal and supernatural. Hannah is dedicated to making history accessible beyond academia and then using history as a lens to understand and question the present. Her talk today is titled Conversations Across Time, Elizabeth Siddal and Christine de Pisan.
So, across nearly half a millennium, two almost identical images speak to one another, or rather, they evoke viewers who do so. The first image is from the so-called Queen's Manuscript, a gorgeous collection of the works of the 15th century writer Christine de Pisan. The manuscript was commissioned and curated by de Pisan herself and presented to Queen Isabeau of France in 1414. Through her careful curation of a network of illuminations, de Pisan addresses future viewers too, amongst them Elizabeth Siddal. Siddal was a key member of the pre-Raphaelite circle, and with her husband Dante Gabriel Rossetti, was responsible for the second image here, a re-visualization of de Pisan's work. And then there's us. As 21st century observers, we enter the conversation between Siddal and de Pisan. We are readers and viewers who delight in the exquisite aesthetics of these images. And we have new things to interject into the dialogue between Siddal and de Pisan. We have access to the great richness of Christine de Pisan's writings in edited and translated form, so we can interject even more texture into Siddal's response to de Pisan. And we can engage with Christine de Pisan's address to future viewers because we, from our 21st century vantage point, know more of many of these, such as Siddal. And our interjections matter in this conversation. Like de Pisan and Siddal, we live in a period in which women's roles are being reconfigured and challenged, even if the contours of these debates look very different. So these images and their viewers do very particular things in their own periods. They are, of course, historically contingent, but they also loop across time. These are not so much echoes as conversations. As the implications of these images traverse the centuries, their parameters shift and the conversation evolves. In the case of this particular image, each subsequent period makes the courtly couple depicted here do something new and different. The courtly couple becomes part of debates and conversations in the 15th, 19th, and 21st centuries, respectively, and all these conversations riff off one another. They resonate to one another's frequencies, and the underlying harmonies change. And the insights of subsequent periods can indeed make fresh claims about what the image is doing in its own period. So these conversations move backwards and forwards across time. Precisely because in their own times, these images acknowledge past and future iterations. They look backwards with something akin to nostalgia, but they also call out to future viewers. So this isn't a paper about afterlives. These images are moving forwards and backwards across time. So folio 376, rectos, I've got the wrong one here, sorry about that. Get the right one, of Harley 4431 in the British Library, shows the opening sequence of de Pisan's Sans Ballade d'Amants et de Dames. Christine de Pisan was an extraordinarily prolific late medieval writer who had travelled to France as a child with her father, Tommaso di Benvenuto da Pisano, who was court astrologer to Charles V of France in 1368. She married a French courtier, but when her father died in 1388, followed by her husband in 1389, de Pisan turned to writing to support herself and her children. She died in around 1430, by which time she had produced a huge oeuvre, ranging from political theory to lyric poetry. De Pisan made eloquent interventions into the vitriolic public debate known as the Querelle de la Rose, a quarrel of the rose, a debate about the supposed virtues and mostly vices of women. So de Pisan's work is a beacon for the female lyric and political voice. Christine de Pisan's careful curation of 29 of her texts in what became known as Harley 4431 was then an intervention in a febrile atmosphere of increasingly offensive comments about the inherent evils of womanhood. And a miniature on folio 3R depicts the moment of presentation of this manuscript to the Queen of France and embeds the relationship between the two women in an all-female space of political power. Christine de Pisan chose a network of 130 miniatures throughout the manuscript, which worked illustratively both to render the imaginative work of the texts more vivid and didactically to explore the principal themes for audiences. The images were executed by the so-called Cité des Dames master and the Bedford master, and the manuscript was worked on by at least 4 border illuminators, including one Anastasia, whom Pisan singles out for particular praise as a successful and skilled woman in her text. But more than this, these images work, I really struggle to say this word, mnemonically, to imprint key themes upon the minds of the viewers of the manuscript. And in this sense, the images are explicitly future-oriented. They speak to those who will pick up the manuscript in the future. With their bright colours, schematic layouts, and repeated motifs, the illuminations are designed to imprint themselves on the memory. The conversation then is rich and ongoing, precisely because Christine de Pisan addresses the future in this way. So the folio on 376 recto of the 2 courtly lovers is part of a great scheme dominated by a key figure who returns again and again in various guises. And that figure is Christine de Pisan herself. De Pisan became immediately recognizable as a serious-looking, seated woman sitting at a slanted desk in an architectural surround with a large white double hennin. And she's almost always wearing a long blue dress. So British Library, Harley 4431, opens with de Pisan in this outfit, where she is, oops, I've got them all in the wrong order here, where she is presenting her manuscript to the Queen, which we may see in a minute when I get to that slide. We then see her presenting her book to the King in the same garb, on folio 95R. But a figure who looks exactly like de Pisan herself is recognisably present in a number of other images also, ones which are not explicitly depicting the author of the text. Right, so we've got some examples here where you can see these are not images of Christine presenting her text. They're not explicitly images of Christine, but it's recognisably a figure who reminds us of the figure which is identified as Christine. So we have various examples there. She is in the background. Here she is looking upwards. Here she is, or potentially, here is a figure who reminds us of Christine receiving a casket. The repetitive quality of these images entangles Christine de Pisan as author as one amongst many figures peopling her narrative, mnemonically impressing on us, the viewers, de Pisan's own centrality in her project. The text provides a strong and richly textured rebuke to the misogynist diatribes of de Pisan's contemporaries. The images project that conversation into the future by ensuring that de Pisan is imprinted on the minds of those who encounter the manuscript. So the image on 376R is not an image explicitly of de Pisan, but as the very last image in a manuscript of 399 folios, by the time de Pisan's future readers reach this point, they have been accosted again and again by de Pisan addressing them visually out of the manuscript. So these are vocative portraits. We encounter this final image at the start of a collection of poems which de Pisan entitles the 100 Ballades d'Amant et de Dame, the 100 Ballads of the Lover and His Lady. Here, de Pisan uses the ballad form and the pairing of two lovers to foreground the role of the courtly lady as not, emphatically not, a passive vessel of the sophisticated outpourings of the chivalric hero. Rather, this woman is an active participant in a relationship which becomes more complex with each ballad. Quoique n'eusse courage ne penser quant à présent de dit amoureux faire. So even though I didn't really have the courage or the intention at the moment of writing amorous love ballads, she goes on to say that's what she's going to do. This is the text immediately underneath the image, which thus sort of produces an elision between the figure of the courtly lady in the illumination and Christine de Pisan herself. So the image works with the text, not only to elide female author and female character, but also to imprint this elision on our minds as viewers of the manuscript. So the manuscript enjoyed a long and colourful life, eventually passing to the British Museum or Library in 1753. In the late 19th century, Harley 4431 caught the attention of Elizabeth Siddal, lover and then wife of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. She was an artist, a poet, and a muse. We don't have documentary evidence that Elizabeth Siddal herself was able to visit and examine this manuscript in the British Museum, but we do know that members of her immediate circle had called up this manuscript. And we do know that she was responsible for the design and conception of a beautiful casket adorned with images from the manuscript. This casket. So the casket took the image of the two lovers on folio 376 of Harley 4431 and reproduced it on the central panel here. A second image from folio 128 verso was reproduced on the front left panel of the casket. Further images of a couple on the front right panel, a pair of figures and a castle in the right panel of the lid, and a boat with two figures in the left panel of the lid, don't match any specific illuminations in Harley 4431, but they reproduce motifs which are seen repeatedly across the illuminations on its pages. The casket was probably given by Elizabeth Siddal and Dante Gabriel Rossetti to Jane Burden on the occasion of her marriage to William Morris in 1859. We have very little documentary evidence about this. The only textual description of the casket was by May Morris, when she described how her mother would sometimes let the children play with her jewellery box, which is a lovely image. But Elizabeth Siddal herself gives us visual clues which draw a gorgeous connection across the centuries between herself and Christine de Pisan. Of course, we need to ask how Siddal might have encountered these images. Frederick Sandys painted the same image in the 1850s, so it's possible that he mediated Siddal's encounter with the original. But I think this is a slightly irritating argument that she could possibly have done it herself. And actually it's rather problematic. Up until the 1960s, readers were allowed to bring watercolours into the British Library and to copy the manuscript whilst it was placed in a glass case. So why not Siddal? And moreover, close examination of the images shows that Siddal copied the yellow flecks on the lady's headdress present in 4431, but those are not present in Sandys's rendering of the original. And also Sandys didn't bother copying the image on folio 128 verso, which Siddal did choose. So that seems to me a fairly good indication that's not the kind of mediator. We know that Siddal had already encountered a number of other manuscripts encouraged by John Ruskin. So we know about her interest in manuscript culture. We know from her, gosh, I'm doing a hopeless job of moving through the slides, sorry about that. We know from her image, Clark Saunders, for example, that she's interested in thinking about medieval manuscripts. You have the Book of Hours there, sitting beside the couple. So this casket then is part of a conversation across the centuries. But what did Siddal know of Christine de Pisan? The answer is very little. She would not have had the skills, we assume, to read the manuscript, nor was de Pisan's work yet fully edited or translated into modern English. But de Pisan's role as a great female writer was known. Some of de Pisan's texts have been edited and provided in modern English translation in Thomas Dibdin's Typographical Antiquities. The first volume of that had been published in 1810. And by the 1850s, there was an engraving circulating pretty widely of de Pisan sitting at her desk writing, that image we saw from the start of this manuscript. So Christine de Pisan was known, it's just that the detailed knowledge of her texts wasn't. So Siddal did not randomly just choose a nice-looking medieval manuscript and copy some scenes. Engaging with Christine de Pisan was her very particular engagement with pre-Raphaelite medievalism. It was a particular choice. A choice to join forces with a woman who had spoken out on behalf of women. Whilst William Morris sought out what he saw as the proto-socialism of John Ball, and whilst Ruskin revelled in the moral purity of the past, or Rossetti sought out kind of aesthetic romanticism, Elizabeth Siddal sought out her own conversations with her medieval forebears. Her choice to include another direct reference on the leftmost panel, her replication of particular motifs, the boat, the castle, her engagement with the colour scheme, you might notice that she reverses the colour scheme, all speak to a close reading of a network of images across the manuscript. And as we saw earlier, these images did more than just illustrate the text. Their emblematic function, working mnemonically to foreground de Pisan's own presence in the text, makes Siddal's careful leafing through the manuscript a true encounter. And what about the casket itself? Oh gosh, I've got more than the wrong way. Sorry about that. So there is a casket depicted in Harley 4431 itself, one which looks remarkably similar to the 19th century object gifted by Siddal and Rossetti to Jane Burden. On folio 122 verso, a miniature depicting Jason and Medea is included. Medea is handing a casket exactly the size of Siddal's casket to Jason. The story of Medea, of course, is one of female power in its most terrifying form. And Siddal would not have been able to read de Pisan's text here, at least I assume she wouldn't. But the description underneath the image is fairly readily decipherable. You can identify the figures of Jason and Medea. So by this reading, Siddal's choice becomes emblematic of female power via a relatively subtle gesture. So Siddal's choices on this casket then were likely conscious ones. They didn't come from detailed engagement with de Pisan's writings because they weren't available to her. But they did come from engagement with de Pisan's standing as a great female writer who'd spoken up in a vivid debate about the value of women as active, creative, and political agents. Siddal engaged with de Pisan via the image which she copied, precisely because de Pisan had deliberately made herself omnipresent in the manuscript, and she could then open up a dialogue across the centuries. The conversation with the Middle Ages was, of course, in full flow in the 19th century. But in painting Christine de Pisan onto her gift to Jane Burden, Siddal was articulating her own part in the medievalist conversation. Her male contemporaries were obsessing with the romance of the past and its social commentaries, and Siddal set herself apart by consciously choosing to undercut these romance narratives and by engaging with the most famous female writer of the Middle Ages. What about us? If Elizabeth Siddal was an interlocutor with Christine de Pisan through image, we are, in turn, viewers of Siddal's image. We encounter Siddal, we encounter de Pisan, and we encounter each of those via the other. More than this, though, we are interlocutors ourselves because we bring a fresh set of perspectives and knowledge. So I said, Siddal would not have had access to full editions and translations of the texts illustrated in the miniatures which she so loved in Harley 4431. But by contrast, we do have access to these texts, just as we have access to a wealth of scholarship on Christine de Pisan and her writings. As modern viewers, we are in a position to unpack the implications of the juxtaposition of courtly love image with the text of the Son Ballade d'Amant et de Dame. And this changes quite substantially the ways in which we approach the images and the ways in which we engage in conversation with them. So the ballads are really interesting. They're dialogic ballads, themselves a conversation between the amant, the lover, the dame, the lady, and occasionally the allegorical figure of amour. Pisan placed this text as the very last one in her compendium of 29 of her writings. And rather than closure, the volumes close with a set of poems which challenge and subvert and thoroughly discombobulate. The first set of ballads in this set of 100 present the lady rejecting the overtures of the lover on the basis that men can rarely be trusted, and because she also just doesn't need love to feel fulfilled. So in ballad 8, she says, Je vis sans lui, that's amour, en plaisance et en joie, par amour n'aime ne aimer ne voudroit. So I live without love in perfect delight and joy. I don't feel the need to love or be loved. Finally, she agrees to a relationship with him, but only after effectively being gaslit by the figure of Amour, who's a kind of allegorical figure, in an excruciating verse which undermines her rational and eloquent refusals by sweeping away her right to reason about the issue. So in Ballad 10, Amour says to her, Mignotel qui bien chante, puis-tu fuir le reton qui vient et se présente, puis joyeux, puis douloureux. So, sweetie, who's singing so nicely, do you really think you can flee from the happy times which are presenting to you, which will bring joy and then grief? Once the relationship is then underway, the dialogue continues as a set of ballads present the mistrustful suspicions of the amant, the lover. His constant accusations against the dame are cruel, but undermine the cogency of his own chivalric masculinity as voiced in the texts. Pour votre honneur et pour le mien, belle, un petit me faut partir de ce pays. So for your honor and for my own honor, oh beautiful one, I'm just going to have to go away for a while. So it's the amant who is inconstant, traveling far away and leaving the lady pining, just as she predicted in the opening ballad when she pulled away from his advances. The text enacts a kind of horrible circularity as the lady reasons, has her reason undercut, submits, and then lives through the reality of precisely what she reasoned would happen. The final ballad sees, it's ballad 100, sees her lay down her life, ostensibly dying for love, but rather annihilated by the contradictions that she's forced to inhabit. The imperative to love when she knows that it destroys, the claim to listen to her voice only to undermine her own reason, the injunction to be faithful when she faces only faithlessness. The undermining of her clear-sightedness, the silencing of her voice, the impossible contradictions between men's demands of honour and yet sexual submission, and fundamentally a kind of exhaustion, complete the cycle, and indeed Christine's entire manuscript. J'ai yeux troublés et voix mue, car je me défous le cœur. So my eyes are troubled, my voice is silenced, because my heart is failing. The parallels here with the life of Elizabeth Siddal are painfully obvious. Without any need to levy accusations at Dante Gabriel Rossetti or any of his circle, Siddal did die tragically young in 1862. She did find herself pressured into a relationship. She did try to pull away, at least by 1858, resumed her relationship with Rossetti in 1860, and knew that he was unfaithful to her, even whilst she was constantly accused of having affairs. And we do know that Siddal was labelled as a muse rather than as a painter, remembered more for her ability to lie still in a bath of freezing water posing as Ophelia than for her own poetry and paintings. So as 21st century readers and viewers then, with our access to Christine de Pisan's oeuvre in a modern edition, we review Siddal's pictorial engagement with her 15th century interlocutor. As 21st century readers, we can appreciate the ways in which Siddal's casket engaged with the complexity of de Pisan's messaging about the nature of courtly love and what it does for and to women. This isn't about historical anachronism. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that our voices too are part of a conversation across the centuries. We too are concerned with many of the issues with which Siddal and de Pisan were grappling, although the implications of those issues are of course contingent on our own historical moment. And our engagement with Christine de Pisan is also thus inflected. As we scrutinise the tiny details on Elizabeth Siddal's casket, we return as readers and viewers to de Pisan's manuscript, Harley 4431, and we can respond to her call to future audiences with more nuance. Our exploration of the resonances of de Pisan's exploration of female voices and her challenges of the assumptions of courtly love paradigms and conventional romance look different when they're put in conversation with a late 19th century reader and viewer whose own life was entangled with these dynamics. I think the most moving event that I've ever spoken at about my research took place at the Feminist Library in Peckham. It brought together scholars of women's history with survivors of domestic abuse, social workers, and women's refuges. The writings of Christine de Pisan were placed in dialogue with the experiences and voices of these survivors. So it was a sort of workshop. And as we discussed de Pisan's thematization of the importance of voice, one of the domestic abuse survivors shared that when she'd finally escaped from a terrifyingly toxic relationship, she had completely lost her ability to speak. She was diagnosed with acute thyroid problems, and it took several years for her voice to return. It felt as though Christine de Pisan was there in the room listening. And I wish now that somehow we had found a place for Elizabeth Siddal too. These conversations across the centuries continue. They move backwards and forwards across time, and they present opportunities to challenge assumptions and to offer solidarity.
So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you, as if Michael needs introduction, in this case, another not just dear colleague, but a very dear friend, Michael Ann Hawley. Michael is Star Director Emerita of the Research and Academic Program at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Before that, she co-founded the Visual and Cultural Studies graduate program at the University of Rochester. So Michael likes cold places. She's the author of books and essays on the theory and intellectual history of the history of art, including Panofsky and the Foundations of Art History, published in 1984, and Past Looking, Historical Imagination and the Rhetoric of the Image in 1996. And The Melancholy Art personally has very much stayed with me over the years from 2013, I believe. Michael's most recent book, published last summer, is titled Somewhere Between Art History and Phenomenology, at the Still Point of the Painted World, published by Edinburgh University Press. Her talk today is titled Pause in Print and Paint, a Phenomenological Perspective.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited by the Dutch Art Institute, especially in celebration of Gervase Robson. And I really appreciate all that Lia and Constanza have done to try to get me here. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but maybe we can forget that for the time being if the technological gods bless us. Anyway, yes, I realize I should have put in little letters too, but pause in print and paint, a phenomenological perspective. How does time get into a work of art? And what sort of time is it when it gets in there? Does it occur before, during, after a work of art's creation? Does every object possess its own time? As Herder once said, Keith told me that. Or does everything in the world contain multiple times within it? Could you put the first slide on, please? Okay. What do you see in this print? A lion, no doubt, a sleepy beast, his eyes half closed, a much smaller dog curled up fearlessly next to him, their paws gently touching. Sunlight streaming into the room through mullioned windows, softly illuminating a solitary scholar, his halo even brighter than the afternoon sun, cavorting with patches of light on a cluttered floor beneath a well-timbered ceiling. Bent over his text, writing or reading or contemplating the miniature crucifix on his desk, he is preoccupied, neither glancing towards nor duly worried about the majestic predator lying on the stone steps into his small study, nor the barren skull, harbinger of his own coming demise, propped on the broad windowsill. Accoutrements and our symbols characterizing his life abound: a cardinal's hat, an hourglass, a fecund gourd, a letter rack, ancient books, a candle extinguished just a moment before, a quill pen soaking in preparation for tomorrow's labors, a pair of scissors, recently vacated slippers, scattered pillows, a chair placed askew nearby as though its occupant has just left the conversation, the monogram of the artist from the 16th century, intruding on a 4th century monastic cell, his signature lying between the spindly legs of the chair, the created who brought this all into being through his restless imagination. How do we write or talk about this work of art, separated as we are by historical distance, time scrambled all together in one magisterial print? Albrecht Dührer's 1514 engraving is a portrait of Saint Jerome, a 4th century theologian known for his Latin translation, the Vulgate, of Hebrew and Aramaic scripture and accompanying commentaries. It is a portrait of Jerome, yes, indeed, but it is also a portrait as well of peaceful intellectual industry, an allegorical portrait of piety, an iconographic thematic frequent for centuries. Only the scratch of the quill pen seems to disturb the silence of the room. Jerome's cell, devoid of any distant landscape, is not organized by perspectival principles. It is, in fact, a masterful demonstration of the potential of Alberti's early 15th century design. The eccentric vanishing point, however, does not vanish here. It turns back to encounter us. Or rather, it is only implied, blocked as it is by the shelves, barely 1/10 of an inch from the right edge of the wall behind. The vanishing point comes to nestle inside Jerome's room, snug and sheltered. Inside or outside, it is the locus where the material and the immaterial, the sacred and the secular, time and timeliness meet, the moment of their transposition into engraved incision and ink. The perspectival construction creates a serene box-like monastic cell, one that implies that time cannot reach inside, a time out of time in which the scholar writes. The skull, the hourglass, the half-burnt candle, the time of the day. Is it really sunlight of early morning or of a mid-afternoon? And the crucifix are details cunningly placed to remind both the saint as well as his beholder, however, that the stasis of the room is deceptive. The central commanding figure of the lion, stretched out on the top step leading into the cozy room, lazily invites the brave putative viewer inside from outside. Who would dare to step over the king of beasts in reality, unless the creature himself comes from another imaginative realm, another dimension of time, an extraordinary illusion far removed from the ordinariness of Jerome's chamber? A myth, an attribute, a household pet? What is he doing there? How does a work of art let us see or intimate what is usually beyond our imagination? What effective play with time is it doing so effortlessly? Many are the stories of the mythical connections between saints and animals throughout history. The tale of Jerome and the lion originated in Jacobus Veragne's 13th century golden legend, in which he tells tales of scores of saints. At solitary prayer in his monastery one day, Jerome encounters a lion that roars and limps into the sacred precinct, frightening all the monks except self-possessed, kindly Jerome. The feline lifts his short, sore paw to reveal a nasty embedded thorn that the holy man carefully removes before dressing its festering wound. Forever after, the grateful animal takes up residence, docilely doing one deed or another, while accompanying Jerome and his fellow monks on their ascetic duties. On what level might we locate this beast in this print? No doubt he serves to identify Jerome as the well-known attribute of his story, the fulcrum on which the apocryphal anecdote balances. But isn't he something more? He is the very personification of comfort and peace, more of a presence of the ineffable than a representation of the material. A magisterial introduction to the mood of the picture. And in what time are we? Where are we, its spectators? I am calling upon two works of art, both about scholars of the past. This engraving by Dürer, and in a moment, a painting that may or may not be by Rembrandt. But first, a theoretical aside. Fascinated by mid-century classical phenomenology and its possibilities for thinking about time in art, I'd like to rehearse just a few of its more engaging tenets that I am employing as a theoretical subtext, phenomenology, for this brief presentation. Why phenomenology? It injects a dose of magic and wonder into our art historical studies, if only we let it. Phenomenology can offer a poetic turn away from the straitjacket of objectivity, iconography, attribution, social context, and so on. Phenomenology can bestow an intensity of feeling that liberates visual works from being cocooned in the routine investigative protocols of a certain time and place. For the most part, thinkers such as Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Gaston Bachelard wrote about the literature, especially poetry, but they also offer hints about how scholars might talk about time in visual art. Do we need philosophy really to appreciate these historical works of art, here interwoven with a scattering of phenomenological sentences and sentiments? No, certainly not. But rubbing them together can ignite a few new interpretive sparks, insinuating, hinting, and provoking, especially about time and the visual arts. The visual so often holds us captive. Phenomenology encourages, even dares, one to think about what is whispered, hidden, concealed, or veiled over by a prosaic professional exchange with objects and images, as it summons an invisible underlying the visible, as its philosophers would say. The experience of a painting or a print, corporeally felt or in prose translation, is never constrained by what we can find out about it, as a traditional art historical route would suggest. The emphasis in phenomenology is on affect and description rather than effect and context. Many observers feel the tenor of this or that work of art in their bones, or as Heidegger put it in another context, the painting spoke. In its vicinity, we are suddenly somewhere else than we usually tend to be. Unquote. It is the evanescent moment, a pause, in other words, when time stops or past time returns, memories and meanderings, when we fall into the work's pure presence, our bodies become entangled, favorite word of phenomenologists, encircled by other times. We yearn for what we cannot see, but perhaps once knew, or might soon become aware of. The magic of visual art. Thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears, in the words of the poet Wordsworth. Again, the moment when time stops, our pastime returns. Something swells up before us in all its strangeness, the unconcealedness of being, a sudden clearing, Heidegger calls it, a lighting in the dark forest. Interplay of showing and concealing, visibility and invisibility. Merleau-Ponty recognizes this as, quote, two inseparable aspects of transcendence, a work of art's irrecusable presence and the perpetual absence into which it always withdraws, unquote. A momentary process where the object, he says, will suddenly, so I was thinking about this a couple of days ago with the Day of the Dead ceremony. He says a momentary process where the object pull back and be absorbed into the world, just as ghosts return through the fissures of the earth from which they came when day breaks. Despite the potential clamor of this simultaneity at times, A magical work of art, in Roland Barthes' conception, quote, speaks to us precisely when it is silent, when it no longer transmits any direct historical message to us. The next slide, please. Thanks. Here's another one of my favorite pictures, this one in Stockholm. A 17th century painting that may or may not be by Rembrandt, loosely called A Christian Scholar in a Vaulted Room of 1631. I'd been enchanted with this painting for years, but had never seen the original. When invited to speak at the Swedish National Museum a decade or so ago, I inquired if I might see the painting somewhere because I couldn't locate it anywhere in the museum. Talk about historical distance. I was escorted down to the storage vault where it had been quietly resting in the dark, out of museum time, perhaps, for some years. Was it banished there by the Rembrandt Research Project, I wondered? Had it failed that team's harsh and sometimes discredited standards of what might be attributed to the master? Another thing, its reproductions had made me assume, excuse me, that it was much larger than this small painting actually is. How could so much of a meditative mood be condensed into such a small and delicate material artifact? How can a work of art as rare as this hold my attention enthralled? There the Christian scholar sits in a chilly, dusky room, his feet nestled cozily on a charcoal burner, a crucifix on a small altar behind him. Sorry, it's hard to see these details. And to the right, tacked on the wall behind him, an illegible script written on a piece of paper, all tenebrous details that draw curiosity in and make us desire to know more, give more to the picture, perhaps, than the picture wishes to give us. Baudelaire, in a poem about Rembrandt, but not about this painting, invokes a room, quote, adorned by one enormous crucifix in which a sudden ray of winter sunlight falls. The name long attached, Anastasius, may or may not be accurate. 4th century martyr, pope, a jurist, a bishop, or most likely an Eastern Orthodox Church father of the 7th century, abbot of Mount Sinai, known for his scriptural commentaries. Neither the name of the artist, not even this artist, nor the identification of the time of its subject really matters, at least not off the bat. Why not? Sometimes for art historians, it takes a real effort to forget the work of art as an object buttressed by external historical, social, biographical, and other temporal cultural forces, rather than see it as a surface for contemplation, something for us now, something to think with rather than about. Phenomenologists such as Bachelard offer warnings. Quote, the prudent attitude itself is a refusal to obey the immediate dynamics of the poetry or paint. Speaking of spaces and rooms born of memories in his 1958 Poetics of Space, Bachelard asks magical questions, and they're not, these magical questions are not about this particular painting, but still, anyway, these magical questions about solitude and always its companion solace, such as, quote, was the room a large one? Was the garret cluttered up? Was the nook warm? How, in this fragment of space, did the human being achieve silence? How did he relish the very special silence of solitary daydreaming? Here, the unconscious abides. Memories are motionless. Unquote. No historical pyrotechnics here, just quiet. Obviously, for me, this work has all the transfiguring ingredients that appeal on another register. A scholar, alone with his books, completely absorbed in his reading and silent ruminations. The quiet that settles over him at this certain time of day, this time of year. Reverie, reflection, oblivious not only to the world outside, but even to his own spacious surround. And most of all, this pensive figure's total lack of acknowledgement of us, whomever we may be as observers, either in the 17th century or in the 21st. Nevertheless, we are certainly there. Approaching Bachelard's words on a hermit's hut, the picture makes me daydream about solitude. Quote, a valorization was centered of concentrated solitude. The hermit is alone before God. And there radiates about this central high solitude a universe of meditation and prayer, a universe outside the universe. How is it that images as rare as these should possess such power over the imagination? And with those words, Bachelard wasn't even asking this of the painting. Resonances, reveries, reverberations. The painting, for a moment, possesses its viewer through and through, wandering thoughts. It's difficult even to see around its murmurings, its edges. The subject of this very small work, contemplation, has so saturated its very being that 400 years later, for me, it remains more of an event than a painted object. Its aura is intact. The embodied experience of seeing it there, maybe even if it had been hanging on the museum wall upstairs, delivered a sting, a prick that even a good reproduction could never confer. Benjamin describes that sensation best. He says, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happened to be. In the 400 years of its material life, the thingness of the thing accruing worlds like barnacles of time, multiple temporalities from the past and the present intertwining. Embodied here is the acute awareness that this thing, this very object, has been touched, has been painted by a most sensitive and talented someone long gone, long ago. Its very physical texture belongs to another age. And secondly, arises the creeping recognition that this work of art has a longer and richer life ahead of it than its beholders, us. Than ever hoped for. No doubt it will outlast us, whomever, whenever we may be. It is only in confronting the actual material object that we also encounter our own mortality, an awareness of the endless cycle of being and becoming. In this frightening world today of noise, turmoil, trial, tragedy, here is a spot, a moment of peace, quiet, solace. How to write about it if we're art historians? How do art historians interlace these sorts of temporal segments through all the iconological, connoisseurial, social, biographical, all those other contextual narratives that dominate the study of 17th century Northern art, Rembrandt in particular? Not that there's anything misguided about these venerable art historical approaches, but I'm trying to do something else. We must remember that an original work of art, a Rembrandt painting, for example, exists in our own time and space, even in the artificial ambience of a museum. And it beckons us for corporeal response by dint of its own phenomenological presence. The world of the past is metonymically attached to the present through the physical stuff it has left behind, material metonymy. It is the recognition that an authentic fragment or vestige of something, once rich and whole, lingers there for us in its own material aftermath. Time, Rembrandt's or ours, dissolves into space, condensed, compressed, concentrated, and consumed. What is encountered there is not just the stories about context that led to its existence once upon a time, but a material performance, the living, pulsing afterlife of the past, now. Thank you.